It's nearly a year since President Cyril Ramaphosa announced his plans to boost the struggling economy. The aim was to create more jobs, restore investors' confidence, and grow the economy. The unemployment rate is currently at 29%, while the economy is in the doldrums. Is the economic stimulus plan working, and what needs to be done to boost the economy? Well, Duma Gqubule from the Center for Economic Development and Transformation, and Saul, Levin, the Executive Director at Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies, are my guests this evening. Good evening to both of you, the gentlemen, and thank you very much for your time. I still remember, Duma Gqubule, how you are not quite as enthusiastic as a lot of people were when the stimulus package was announced last year.
Let's just go back over here. So what happened last year is that on the 3rd of September, roundabout, the Stats SA announced that we had gone into the second recession since the global financial crisis. And 2 weeks later, on the 21st, the President announced a stimulus and recovery plan. So we were waiting with bated breath for something to get our economy out of this deepest post-apartheid economic crisis, and it was a big disappointment. So what the President announced was that there would be 50 billion rand reprioritization within the existing expenditure envelope, and he announced a 400 billion rands infrastructure fund. Now, at the budget this year, the government allocated 1 billion rands to the 400 billion rand infrastructure fund, and nothing next year and nothing the following year. So the 400 billion rand infrastructure fund that was announced to great fanfare hasn't yet got off the ground. And I just have to mention, just to explain what a stimulus is. A stimulus is to get the economy, a moribund economy, working again. We saw some, after the global financial crisis, the Chinese announced a 586 billion rand stimulus. It was 12.5% of GDP. The US government announced a 787 billion rand stimulus. And the idea is to put new money into the economy to get the economy going. So what we had, there was zero new money into the economy. So I do not understand why the government still insists in calling it a stimulus and recovery plan when it wasn't a stimulus and recovery plan. And typically stimulus and recovery plans deliver pick up in growth within months, within 3 to 6 months, as happened in China and a bit longer in the United States. So I think we really have to have a national discussion going in our country right now. We are in the worst post-apartheid economic crisis. We've had 18 months of this new administration under President Ramaphosa, and we've seen gimmick after gimmick, 5 gimmicks. We've seen the Youth Employment Summit, Youth Employment Scheme. We've seen the appointment of investment summits. The President had a job summit, and we had a report back from the job summit where the President was really...
A report that never was.
The report wasn't made public, but what it showed was that the job summit was supposed to create 275,000 jobs. It has created less than 5,000 jobs, yeah. So that wasn't given to the public, yeah.
Okay. Saul, your reflections, going back to where we were when the stimulus package was announced and looking at where we are now.
The things that we've done have been to fix institutions, to sort out the state capture. These are long-term measures, coupled with all of the things that we didn't do that Duma has spoken about, which would have given us much more of a boost in terms of our economic stimulus. There's also been a global economic crisis. And we're seeing the trade wars caused by the US and China causing havoc on our major trading partners. So Germany's economy is down this last quarter. The UK's economy, because of Brexit, is also down. So we're seeing a whole lot of other factors impacting on our economy. So if the presidential team had hoped that the package that announced last year would catch a wave of economic boom that may have been thought was going to happen globally, that hasn't happened. In fact, we've seen the reverse. And we've also seen how that's then impacted on our own economy, because we export minerals, we export a lot of things that aren't being consumed now in the global markets. And we're also facing greater levels of imports.
In fact, I mean, some analysts, I remember back then, did raise this issue. In other words, as people were beginning to punch holes into what the president had said, the promises that were being made, they did point out that the stimulus package did not speak to a weakening sentiment towards emerging markets and, of course, the trade wars. And as we know now, the U.S.-China trade war is affecting, emerging markets quite negatively.
Yeah, so those factors have played out. Plus, we've scored lots of own goals with our state-owned enterprises. We haven't fixed Eskom in the way that it needs to be fixed, and it's a big drain on our economy. Not having a functional state utility that provides cheap electricity weighs us down. And it's been an institution that has generated a lot of growth in the past because of its own spend, but also because of providing energy to much-needed sectors. We also haven't properly made the transition to green energy, and that's another factor. We are facing huge carbon emission problems because we continue to burn coal, and the soon-to-be-released IRP will hopefully deal with that. But what we are seeing then is a whole lot of compounded effects with climate change and with trade issues impacting on us. The climate change is another issue because we're now experiencing more droughts than we were a few decades ago. So instead of us having a drought once every 10 years, it's now looking like a drought once every 3 years. When our agricultural sector declines, that impacts on our economic growth because that has a knock-on impact on the rest of the economy.
Now, speaking of own goals, that Saul is talking about, Gqubule, at the time we were told that among the things that we would have to do is to reduce the cost of doing business, and among those, it was to talk about, how there was talk of a review of various administrative prices. Among those, the price of electricity. But look at what Eskom told us only a few weeks ago. It actually wants to charge more, for electricity. It's even taking NESA to court.
I think we shouldn't talk about those things because they've been on the government's agenda for more than 10 years, under President Duma, under President Mbeki, under President Kgalema.
But in this instance, there was a stimulus package. Things were spelled out. Is it a question of perhaps the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing? Because one would have thought that that message would have been communicated to Eskom, and where there were problems, some kind of a solution in the back rooms or whatever would have been found so that they all deliver on the promise that had been made.
Yeah, but you can't promise. Eskom's prices have increased by 300% over the past decade. So you can't promise a review of that when it's out of your hands. There's NERSA that sets the electricity tariffs. There's very little that you can do, yeah. So let me just talk about the stimulus again. Is that the stimulus typically doesn't include so-called microeconomic measures because those take long to deliver. It usually includes a number of short-term measures to get the economy working. And I'm talking about from the Great Depression in the US, the New Deal. Those are proper stimulus plans that are designed to work within a few months, 3 to 6 months. Now, those things that you're talking about take a long time to work through the system.
Yeah. Let's take another promise that was made, Saul. Government said it was going to amend visa requirements to make it easier for people to travel to South Africa. And there was an announcement made, a whole group of countries whose citizens won't require visas to come here. But speaking to industry players, they say they went about doing this the wrong way because the countries that have been exempted aren't in fact the big crowd pullers, the people, the countries that whose citizens come here in bigger numbers and spend more. So to some extent, that exercise has actually been futile, which means that it will not deliver, what it is supposed to.
If you look at the timing, it's been almost a year since the announcement and the visa regulations being relaxed. If we were serious, we should have had those things taking place much quicker, looking at where the largest travelling markets are and saying, how do we target those
Which
citizens?
industry players say isn't the case. They mention Nigeria, they mention India, and they mention China.
We need to get those people to South Africa, visiting our shores, staying in our hotels and spending their holiday funds here. But relaxing the visa requirements on its own, it requires a concerted campaign to market South Africa, to bring in the tourists. And those are the kind of measures. But again, what Duma's saying is that those are long-term strategies, that rebuilding a brand image inside a new country. We need the quick fixes. We need a stimulus that is a proper stimulus that's going to put jobs back into the economy, that's going to be able to grow the economy quite quickly in a very short period of time. So those are the kind of measures that we need. It does mean that we're going to probably have to find resources to do that while we go about making the long-term fixes, because the long-term fixes are happening. We see that every day. We see industry strategies being redeveloped. We see a lot of measures taking place to build confidence in the domestic economy, with government partnering with industry on a whole range of sectors. So those long-term strategies are good, but we need things to happen now, and that's what a stimulus is about.
But then, I mean, if you can't get the basic things, talking about, say, the little money that we do have. Remember, there was a whole reprioritization where people who couldn't spend, you know, I mean, that money was going to be brought back into the system, and way quicker and more efficient ways of spending it would have been found. But if you listen to what the president had to say today, they are still establishing a project management office in the presidency. If you listen to what the president is saying that they are yet to establish a war room, as it is called, that will coordinate the various interventions that government is going to present to potential investors. Now, I mean, if these things still haven't been done, it raises the question of whether they were serious or they treated this whole issue with the urgency that it actually deserves. I mean, he was scathing about the capacity of municipalities, how things don't get done there. But if you listen to what he has to say, the new model now has all these regions, you know, going to like basically be the center, the engines of where things are going to happen. Yet we know that there's no capacity there. In fact, there's no capacity to spend the little that we do have available.
So we've got a new project management office at Eskom on top of many sustainability task teams, many task teams that have been set up over the past 3 years. We've got a project management team to monitor the recommendations of the job summits. So each time there's a project, there's a problem, we set up a war room to solve that problem, and then you look down 6 months later, nothing has happened. But I should mention, we need to improve the efficiency within the municipalities, within the government system, but it doesn't help to be more efficient if there are no new resources coming into the system, and that is what we need to be talking about here.
So?
I agree. We need to make sure that we have strong institutions, we have strong municipalities, we have our SOEs working, and we have government being coordinated and doing things in a coordinated way. But those are long-term fixes. We do need a proper stimulus package, and we need to find a way of creating the jobs and putting resources back into the economy.
How do we go about doing that now, given where we are, all the acknowledgements that have been made, the financial, economic situation we're finding ourselves in, what is happening around the world? Where do we begin now if we have to think afresh?
So if we're saying that you need to invest money to make money, if you go with that simple business logic, we need to borrow and we need to invest. These are difficult choices that we have to make, and there are always going to be trade-offs. But if we're seeing a positive outcome and the money isn't being siphoned off for state capture and it's going to its intended beneficiaries, we can set up public employment programs. It's been done in many other countries, and it's been done very successfully. We have some programs that are already in place. Can we double or triple them? Can we set up proper youth brigade schemes where we have young people in a significant way going out and building houses, for example, like they've done in other countries? So we have small, isolated pockets of these things. Can we ramp them up so that we have, at scale, people being employed to do useful things for the country?
Gentlemen, we've unfortunately run out of time, so we're going to leave. Thanks to both of you for coming through. Duma Gqubule from the Center for Economic Development and Transformation, and Saul Levin, the Executive Director at Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies.